make a start. So firstly, good afternoon, everybody. Firstly, many thanks for taking the time out to join us for today's webinar session. My name's Karen. I'm the Partnership Officer for the Surrey Safeguarding Adults Board. As part of my role, we are developing ways in which we engage and communicate with agencies across the county. And delivering our webinar series is just one of the many ways we'd like to engage with you all to disseminate information and raise awareness around safeguarding issues and priorities. So today we're joined by Professor Michael Preston-Shoot from the University of Bedfordshire. Michael has kindly offered his time today to give us some insights into self-neglect and some of the evidence-based research from safeguarding adult reviews. So today we'll be looking into the deeper insights into self-neglect and understanding some evidence from people with lived experiences. We are recording today's session, so if you do miss anything Michael mentions, we'll be able to find the full recording on our website, along with the presentation slides. We will also offer the opportunity for you to ask questions and give feedback using the link, which I'll pop in the chat bar towards the end. So if you do have any questions or any feedback you'd like to offer the board or Michael, you could just use that link. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Michael.
Okay, Karen, thank you very much. And hello, everybody. Thank you for making the time in your busy schedules to listen to my presentation on self-neglect. The slides will be made available by Karen subsequently alongside a recording of the session. I have 50 slides to work through, and towards the end I'll stop sharing my screen so that if you have any observations to make or questions to ask, we can reserve time for that at the end of the presentation. Excuse me. So here goes. So first of all, we do have a statutory definition in England of self-neglect. It's the top 3 bullet points on this particular slide, and you can find this definition in the statutory guidance that accompanies the 2014 Care Act, in chapter 14 of which is the chapter on adult safeguarding. You can find this definition alongside definitions of other types of abuse or neglect. And you can see from this particular slide that self-neglect covers a variety of scenarios, but you can also see that it is a contested term. Some people object to the phrase self-neglect on the basis that it attributes responsibility only to the individual themselves, when in fact some individuals, by virtue of social disadvantage, discrimination, social exclusion, end up in scenarios that might fit the definition of self-neglect at the top of this particular slide. So it highlights the importance of being very careful about the language that we use, something that people with who might be termed hoarders might well tell you. That what we might describe as hoarding might for them be a priceless collection of artifacts and belongings that have emotional significance for individuals. So just to note that self-neglect is a contested term and highlights the importance of our attention to language. And then a few statistics. We do not have an accurate picture of the prevalence of self-neglect in England. We have some estimates drawn from a variety of research studies, some of which are highlighted on this particular slide, some of which are on a subsequent slide. So you can see estimates of prevalence and you can compute those estimates in terms of your experience in Surrey. And you can see also a limited research in relation to race and culture, particularly from the US, which has a much longer history of working with people who self-neglect and of including adults who self-neglect in the adult protection, adult safeguarding arrangements in the US. A couple of other slides, a couple of other pieces of data in relation to self-neglect, again highlighting data from the US, which, as I've said, has a much longer history of adult protection services in the US working with people who self-neglect. You can also see at the bottom of this slide the fact that safeguarding adult reviews strongly feature self-neglect. It is the most prominently reviewed type of abuse or neglect through safeguarding adult reviews in England. And you can also see an average of Section 42 adult safeguarding inquiries. There's quite a range in my experience as a SAB chair and a SAR author, quite a range of data in relation to Section 42 referrals and Section 42 inquiries. I'm aware, for example, of one safeguarding adult board in the southwest of England, where the self-neglect is the most frequently referred adult safeguarding concern under Section 42. But I'm equally aware that in other areas, Section 42 referrals are most likely to feature physical abuse or neglect and acts of omission rather than self-neglect. So the picture is very variable in terms of Section 42 and self-neglect. The good news is that we do actually have an evidence base for what is most likely to be helpful in relation to adults who self-neglect. And some of that evidence base comes from safeguarding adult reviews. And as I've already featured, self-neglect is the most frequently reviewed type of abuse or neglect through safeguarding adult reviews. And the evidence for that comes from two national analyses of safeguarding adult reviews covering the years April 2017 to March 2023. And my own research on self-neglect indicates that self-neglect remains post-March 2023 the most frequently reviewed type of abuse or neglect. And I think that illustrates the challenges that agencies experience and that practitioners experience working with individuals who self-neglect. And as I identified in an earlier slide, self-neglect covers a variety of scenarios. And if we look at both the first and the second national analysis, you can see the data here in relation to some of those scenarios, many of which involve self-neglect. So you can see an increase in the number of safeguarding adult reviews featuring alcohol dependence, a slight increase in the number of reviews featuring homelessness, a slight increase again in the number of reviews involving tissue viability issues, and the prevalence of mental health across all safeguarding adult reviews. And obviously embedded within these percentages will be cases involving self-neglect. So you may well, in your own lived experience of work, be working with individuals who are dependent on alcohol or other drugs in a context of self-neglect. Similarly, individuals who are experiencing homelessness or individuals who are experiencing severe and enduring forms of mental distress as part of the self-neglect that has been identified. And what we know from both the first and the second national analysis is the frequency of various shortcomings identified through safeguarding adult reviews. A lack of curiosity, a lack of professional curiosity or concerned curiosity, resulting in a failure to identify the backstory. And if there is at least one key message for you to take away this afternoon, it is that there is always a backstory that might help us to understand how a person comes to be the person that we encounter today. Professional curiosity is a commonly found shortcoming. Increasingly, however, I'm using not the phrase professional curiosity or indeed concerned curiosity, but the phrase compassionate inquiry. And this is a phrase given to us all by Jess Turtle, who is one of the leaders in the Museum of Homelessness located in the north of London. And she talks about the importance of compassionate inquiry, trying to understand the backstory, what lies behind a person's presentation. And that compassionate inquiry is particularly important when trying to understand why people very often decline assessments, decline care and support, decline healthcare treatments. The importance of compassionate inquiry to challenge assumptions about lifestyle choice, really to question whether self-neglect is ever a lifestyle choice, and the importance of thorough assessments that include compassionate inquiry, thorough assessments of mental capacity, of risk, of care and support, and so on. And those shortcomings can be identified through safeguarding adult reviews that have reported the voices of people with lived experience. So here are some examples. So, for example, a report from Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. Anthony signed off from work in a very high-profile job in London, returns to Cornwall to live with his mother. And on one occasion, he described to a practitioner, "I drink to feel numb." And no one expressed professional curiosity or compassionate inquiry about what it was that he felt he needed to be numbed against. And indeed, it was only after both Anthony and Mary had died, and I had the privilege and the responsibility of talking with extended family members, that perhaps it began to become a little clearer about why Anthony might have been drinking to feel numb. And that's not a unique finding. It's not an uncommon experience for people to use alcohol or other drugs in order to numb themselves against emotional distress. And similarly, a Tower Hamlets thematic review, where I had the opportunity to interview Mazai's partner, and he gave a graphic account of how Mazai, on occasions when she tried to reduce her dependence on alcohol and other drugs, how things would bubble up, illustrating really quite powerfully that there was a backstory for Mazai, of which her partner was aware, at least to some degree, of that backstory, and pointing out to me and to others through the review that in order to enable people to recover, we need to address not just the manifestations of self-neglect in the here and now, but we also need to address the backstory. And that backstory again illustrated in a poem. This is an excerpt from a poem written by somebody experiencing homelessness, dependence on alcohol. He was living in a vehicle for the final few months of his life. He was a frequent flyer at emergency departments, sometimes involving hospital admissions because of the outcomes of homelessness and substance misuse. And he wrote a poem, which is a powerful illustration of the backstory and how he comes to be the person that he was shortly before he died. You can read the full poem in the publication that is referenced at the top of this particular slide. So, some introduction to some of the voices of people with lived experience, and what we can do by listening to the voices of people with lived experience, particularly those who have survived abuse or neglect, including self-neglect, and what we can do by reading and applying the lessons from safeguarding adult reviews, we can identify what positive practice looks like. And as I run through the slides on positive practice, I would invite you to reflect on your own lived experience of work and how close the service that you are a part of gets to this evidence base, and how close you think the multi-agency, multidisciplinary partnerships in Surrey and elsewhere get to the different components of the evidence base. So in a sense, this is your opportunity to conduct an appreciative inquiry, or if you like, a temperature check. And clearly, if you think that the service of which you are a part and the multi-agency, multidisciplinary architecture, if you think that you're getting close to, or indeed aligning with, the evidence base, then it's important for the Safeguarding Adult Board in Surrey to know that. And if you feel that more often than not, or at least sometimes, services are not aligned with the evidence base, then similarly, it's important that the partners in the Safeguarding Adult Board know that, so that they can translate your lived experience of work into a priority for development in Surrey. And indeed, I know from Karen that self-neglect is currently a priority for the Safeguarding Adult Board and partners in Surrey, and they need to learn from your lived experience of work in order to target their efforts where they are most needed. So here you've got 9 components of positive practice when working directly with individuals. Some of these 9 boxes will be self-explanatory, such as the importance of person-centered, relationship-based practice. And yes, we know that that requires time and might be difficult to provide routinely because of the increasing demands on services and in a context of stretched resources. Professional curiosity, again, I've already highlighted the importance of the backstory, the importance of thorough assessments. Other things which I have not yet mentioned, the importance of focusing on transition. So transitional safeguarding, for example, of care experienced young people the importance of ensuring that children's services and adult services work collaboratively to help care experienced young people manage the transition into young adulthood in a context where we know that care experienced young people are at increased risk of homelessness and indeed substance misuse. The importance of thinking family, because family members often are able to identify aspects of the backstory that it would be helpful for us to know. I reference back to the Safeguarding Adult Review on Anthony and Mary from Cornwall that I flagged up earlier. The importance of recognizing that there are a variety of different agencies that have legal powers that might be useful, and indeed many safeguarding adult boards in their policies and procedures for self-neglect reference the different legal rules that can be drawn on in cases of self-neglect. But perhaps I'd say most importantly in terms of my providing an explanation, balancing autonomy with a duty of care. We often find in safeguarding adult reviews a recorded phrase that runs something along the lines of the person is self-neglecting, the person has capacity, I'm closing the case, there's nothing for me to do here because the person does not wish to engage. We all have a duty of care. And we are not promoting a person's autonomy if we simply walk away because we have assessed somebody as having capacity and they don't want to engage with us. We need to reflect on who is not engaging here. Is it them or is it us? We also need to reflect on whether people need time and the offer of a consistent relationship before they are able to work alongside us to address the scenarios that we encounter. We need to reflect on what might lie behind their refusal or apparent refusal to engage. Is it shame? Is it embarrassment? Is it a previous negative experience of services? The clear message that I'm wanting to give to you is that we are not promoting a person's longer term autonomy by simply walking away in the short term. Someone has a duty of care to attempt to stay involved in the hope of building a sufficient relationship to enable a person to work with us and other services. I've emphasized that there is always a backstory. And what I've done on this slide is to share with you three quotations that in part illustrate the importance of risk assessment, but equally illustrate the importance of not simply walking away when somebody does not wish to work with us. So the first phrase, carefrontational questions, is a gift to me from a person with lived experience, whom I met in the context of research on self-neglect. This person had a history of homelessness, of substance misuse, particularly dependence on Class A drugs, all the signs of self-neglect in his backstory. But when I met him, he was in fact living in his own accommodation. He was substance free and in fact was working in a charity supporting people with the kind of challenges that he himself had experienced. And I asked him what had helped him to turn his life so significantly around. And he said it was the social worker who did not take no for an answer, who kept on returning in an effort to build a relationship with him, and who kept on trying to explore what lay behind his presentation. And he described that as the
I'm
social worker.
taking the statin, aren't I?
Can you please mute yourself? Thank you. Um,
Yeah,
who kept on asking him carefrontational questions, not confrontational questions, but
yeah.
carefrontational questions. Excuse me, but can you please put
Okay
yourself
then.
on mute? Thank you. And indeed, there is another example of carefrontational approaches in a YouTube video that you can Google. On YouTube, there is a 14-minute video known as Keith's Story. And Keith's story is a story of hoarding and of self-neglect, including alcohol dependence. And at one point in the video recording, Keith describes how a girlfriend of his held a mirror up through the observations that she was making about Keith, and that holding that mirror up and a phrase that she used, "I cannot stand to see you living like this," was his trigger for thinking, actually, there's something I need to do here. It was, if you like, a carefrontational observation that enabled Keith to begin to address how he was living. And then the importance of risk assessment, both look for the not so obvious, which was a gift to me from a social work tutor when I was training as a social worker back in the mid 1970s. Look for the not so obvious. And then a quote from a coroner, do not forget the mundane and the obvious. So, and two quotes offering you the opportunity to reflect on whether you feel you have the tools and indeed the knowledge to conduct robust risk assessments. But we need to acknowledge that curiosity is a challenge, compassionate inquiry is a challenge. And indeed, when I reflect back on my 10 years or so as a practicing social worker after I qualified in 1978, there were occasions when I put concerned curiosity or compassionate inquiry in the too difficult box. So when we find in safeguarding adult reviews or in our own practice shortcomings, missed opportunities, if you like, to express concerned curiosity or compassionate inquiry, we need to ask ourselves why that is, and whether we are sufficiently supported by supervisors, peers, operational managers, senior leaders, whether we are sufficiently supported in the challenging and complex work that we are asking you to do. So, if there have been occasions where you are aware, either in your own practice or in other people's practice, of missed opportunities, why was that? And is there more that we can do to support practitioners to be the best practitioners they can be? We also find that making safeguarding personal is often misunderstood, as well as not embedded in practice with people who self-neglect and indeed people who experience other types of abuse or neglect. Making safeguarding personal is not simply identifying what a person wishes, but actually also offering opportunities for an individual to reflect on our contribution that might enable safer outcomes for individuals. And then some human stories from safeguarding adult reviews that feature this part of the evidence base about direct practice. So all of these reviews are published. Most, if not all of them, are reviews I know well because I wrote them. So here in Hazel's story, the importance of thinking family, Wood reaching out to family members enable us to understand better the backstory. Are we reaching out to the individuals themselves rather than simply walking away when they don't wish or apparently don't wish to engage with us? Have we expressed compassionate inquiry or concerned curiosity in order to try to understand, in this situation, Hazel's lived experience? And when we come to mental capacity assessments, are we not simply relying on what an individual says, but actually looking at the impact of life experience, the impact of dependence on alcohol and other drugs, for example, on what an individual is able or is not able to do, captured in the phrase executive functioning? Different kind of case, this time a mother and a son living in South Tyneside, very reclusive, very isolated socially, with a mother who, for whatever reasons, was very, very protective towards her son and shielding her adult son from services. But there was an opportunity, one significant opportunity, perhaps other opportunities, when housing practitioners were undertaking repairs to their social housing, but one significant opportunity when the mother was admitted to hospital and her son was accommodated for a number of days in respite care because he appeared to be unable to look after himself. There was an opportunity to try to explore, both with mother and son, what the backstory was. Unfortunately, that opportunity was missed. And as soon as the mother was discharged from hospital, she discharged her son from respite care, and they returned to a very socially isolated way of living. And indeed, they both died within a number of weeks of each other in their own homes. And I've seen the pictures of both the inside of their homes, but also their emaciated and malnourished states, evidence of clear self-neglect. The voice of lived experience from Ms. I, but also from Ms. H. I've already flagged that up in order to highlight that we need a whole system, whole person response, and we need to address the backstory, not just the immediate presenting problems. A different kind of case, this time involving a fire risk. An opportunity for us all to reflect on whether we know how to refer for home fire safety visits from our fire and rescue service colleagues, whether we are including smoking as a risk in our risk assessments, and how we balance not only one individual's autonomy, but actually also the right to life of individuals living in close proximity to this individual. WWF lived in a block of flats, so she was not the only person at risk of fire. And a case involving Eric, illustrating again the different components, the important components of the evidence base in relation to direct practice, here particularly involving a GP and district nurses expressing insufficient curiosity, particularly with Eric's wife and daughter, about what might lie behind Eric's presentation, retiring to his bed, refusing to eat and drink, lying in his own urine and feces, and refusing support from his GP and district nurses, with the resultant risks in terms of deterioration of his skin integrity and increasing malnourishment. This case illustrates the importance of not simply walking away. It illustrates also the importance of seeking legal advice, particularly in high-risk cases. Social workers and social care workers seeking legal advice from local authority lawyers, GPs, district nurses seeking legal advice through safeguarding specialists in the ICB, and taking time to support caregivers, in this case Eric's wife and daughter, but actually also to try to access what they know about Eric's life journey. And similarly, thinking family in relation to Andy, reaching out in relation to Andy, questioning whether not keeping appointments was Andy being unwilling, or was it more a case that Andy, because of mental distress and physical disabilities, was actually unable to keep appointments in locations and at a time dictated by services. So again, really quite a consistent picture. And similarly with Duncan, and in the interest of time, I'll leave you, when you see the slides after this afternoon, to consider the direct practice issues that Duncan's case involves, particularly making safeguarding personal, and the importance of thorough, multidisciplinary, multi-agency risk assessments. And similar illustrations from a thematic review involving homelessness. But one component that I haven't yet stressed is the importance of using interpreters for people whose first language is not English, and the importance also of thinking about advocacy that might enable individuals to participate meaningfully in Care Act assessments, mental capacity assessments, and indeed mental health assessments. So really to consider, what do we mean by they don't engage? Who is not engaging here? And people with lived experience talk about engagement, they talk about concerned or professional curiosity, they talk about person-centered approaches to working with them. They talk about the importance of being careful about the language that we use, and they talk about the importance of us not making assumptions or stereotyping them. For example, well, this is a lifestyle choice, isn't it? Well, it probably isn't a lifestyle choice. So very rich learning, not just from safeguarding adult reviews, but from people with lived experience. And then the second component of the evidence base, which is how services work together. And here I want to introduce you to a phrase that, if you're working with people experiencing homelessness, you might have come across already. It's part and parcel of the Making Every Adult Matter approach, or the MEME approach. And the phrase is the team around me. And it's basically asking us to reflect on two things. Firstly, are we demonstrating a whole system, whole person response to individuals who self-neglect? Are we putting together a team around the person? But then the team around me. So it's not just putting together a team around the person, but it's actually also, wherever possible, including the individual themselves in the meetings that we have about them. Service users often talk about nothing about me without me. Partnership working, involving the person themselves in the meetings about them. Our children's services colleagues over the last 20, 30 years have become much more used to include children and parents and other concerned adults in case conferences and strategy meetings. In other words, there is a team around me. There is a team around the child and the family. We are much less advanced in adult services in terms of a team around me. So I invite you to reflect on whether there are occasions not just to put a team around the person together, but actually occasions to involve the individuals themselves in the discussions that we have about how to reduce risk and how to meet a person's needs. And the importance, therefore, of working together, sharing records wherever we can, and particularly in complex and challenging cases, ensuring that roles and responsibilities of the different components of the team are clear, and that there is a lead agency and a key worker to coordinate the multi-agency effort. And the human stories again illustrate the importance of bringing together, convening the system, bringing together a team around the person. So I've already introduced you to the case of Duncan that highlighted the absence of multi-agency risk management meetings. I've briefly touched on the Haringey thematic review of people experiencing homelessness, identifying again the absence of multi-agency risk management meetings, but also identifying that there were no safeguarding inquiries, even though services had referred adult safeguarding concerns using the provisions of Section 42(1) of the Care Act. The one case I haven't already introduced you to is published by Havering, or at least the 7-minute briefing is published by Havering. This is two cases of transitional safeguarding where once again there was a lack of use of Section 42 of the Care Act. And on this occasion, although there were multi-agency and/or multidisciplinary meetings, the plans were insufficient to reduce the risks and to ensure collaboration across services. So it's not just the shortcoming in terms of whether or not multi-agency meetings are held, but actually also shortcomings in terms of a failure to identify a plan that would reduce the risks and a failure to review the outcome of the decisions in particular meetings. And again, another case involving self-neglect and homelessness that illustrates actually the importance of concerned curiosity and the importance of thorough mental capacity assessments, but equally it illustrates the importance of convening multi-agency and multidisciplinary risk management meetings and the importance of conducting adult safeguarding inquiries when the 3 criteria in Section 42(1) are clearly met. And adult N, again, illustrating so much of this evidence base of the team around the person. And then the third component of the evidence base is the organizational environment or the organizational support for practitioners and operational managers. And here I would invite you to reflect on a question that I will now ask. And the question is, who looks after you? What I know from the reviews I've done for Safeguarding Adult Reviews, what I know from my experience as a Safeguarding Adult Board Chair, what I know from listening to practitioners in particular is the increasing complexity of work, the increasing demands placed on you of the work, the fact that the work often entails significant risk to the individuals you're working with, but also to you. It often involves considerable anxiety. There may be uncertainty about what the right thing to do is. This is the kind of work that you might take home at the end of the day. Hence the importance of the question that I ask you to reflect on. Who looks after you? What is the quality of supervision? Is your workload manageable? How aware are operational managers and indeed senior leaders? How aware are they of the complexities that you are having to work with, of the demands that are being placed on you, both physically and particularly emotionally? Do you have policies and procedures and protocols that provide you with a framework for your practice? Is it possible for you? Does it feel safe for you to say, actually, I'm lost here, or I'm not sure what to do, or I'm really not happy with how another agency is responding? How do I escalate that? And if you are a provider or a commissioner of service provision, are there routine opportunities in which you can identify what is working well in contracted provision and where there might be gaps or indeed service stretch? So for all of those reasons, how would you answer the question, who looks after you? And once again, we return to the human stories. On this particular slide, you can see 3 of the reviews that I've already introduced, highlighting the importance of not just having policies and procedures, but actually being familiar with what they contained, highlighting the importance of support for practitioners, but equally also highlighting the importance of commissioners and providers having routine opportunities to reflect on what is working well and where further service development is necessary. And one particular case that involves a lack of provision is the Isle of Wight case on Howard. And indeed, I can tell you that this particular safeguarding adult review resulted in service development to fill the gap that was identified through the review as having been present. And in fact, there is a service established called Howard's Hub, which was a direct response to the lack of particular provision on the Isle of Wight for somebody who experienced homelessness and dependence on alcohol. And then the 4th component of the evidence base is governance, the role and responsibility of the Safeguarding Adult Board in Surrey and elsewhere. Karen has established this webinar as part of the Safeguarding Adult Board's effort to support you in your work with people experiencing self-neglect. So it is an example of the Safeguarding Adult Board taking self-neglect as a strategic priority. Safeguarding adult boards often have multi-agency policies and procedures. They often undertake safeguarding adult reviews. I know Surrey has done that. My advice to you would be to access the Safeguarding Adult Board web pages to identify the training opportunities that are available, the safeguarding adult reviews that have been completed and published so that you're familiar with their findings and their recommendations. and so that you access the policies and procedures that the partners to the board have adopted. And then I want to say a few words about mental capacity because it is a frequently identified shortcoming in safeguarding adult reviews, and indeed robust mental capacity assessments are part of the evidence base for best practice in relation to direct work with individuals. I'm not going to focus on the entirety of the Mental Capacity Act and the Code of Practice, but there are one or two things that I just want to stress because of the frequency with which they come up in safeguarding adult reviews. I've already touched on the question of autonomy, and I've invited us to think about whether, rather than simply walking away when an individual says, I do not wish to engage, or is appearing to say, I do not wish to engage, rather than walking away, for someone to continue to try to build a relationship with that individual in the hope that through continuity and the development of trust, it may be possible to begin to address both the presenting issues but also the backstory, because that is more likely to promote their longer term autonomy. But equally, to be really as curious about what we mean by protection. I referenced the YouTube video, Keith's story, earlier. And if you watch that 14-minute video, in addition to the illustration of carefrontational observations, which I mentioned earlier, you will also see practitioners and indeed Keith himself talk about needing to be very careful when we undertake deep cleans and decluttering of an individual's home. In other words, to reduce the risks of hoarding. Because if we do not address the backstory behind the hoarding, we are running the risk of failing to be protective. You will hear both Keith and a practitioner called Heather Matuoso talk about the fear that can result when we simply declutter and deep clean without any attention at all to the backstory and the meanings behind an individual's cluttered environment. So this slide repeats what was in the previous slide about encouraging us to be curious about what we mean by autonomy and indeed curious about what we mean by protection. And then that extends into a well-known quote from Lord Justice Mumby, as he then was, because very often we are called upon to decide what might be in a person's best interests when we have conducted thorough mental capacity assessments and we've determined that an individual does not have capacity to take particular decisions about care and support, or about where they might live, or about the treatment that we might think is in their best interests, but they might be less persuaded by. So what good is it making someone safer if it merely makes them miserable? And there are two cases, both of which you can Google, and I've given you the case law references here, that illustrate the challenges that we very often face in determining what is in somebody's best interests. We've conducted a risk assessment. We know what the risks are. We know about the likelihood and the significance of the risks. The individual themselves does not have capacity to take those decisions, but may well be expressing views. Both Manuela Sykes and AH did not have capacity to take decisions about where they might live or about the treatment that they might receive, but were nonetheless very clear about how they saw their best interests. These are difficult and challenging situations. An earlier slide a moment or two ago highlighted that protection is not about removing all risk. It's about doing what we can to minimize risk, to enable individuals to live as safely as possible. So in Manuela Sykes, the question was, should her liberty be deprived? Should she be deprived of her liberty because she has Alzheimer's? She is at risk of getting lost when she goes out. She's at risk of self-neglect. Should we deprive her of her liberty and require her to live in a nursing home where she will be unhappy? Or should we enable her to return home with the best care package that we can provide where she has expressed a wish to live? And in the AH case, again, should AH be deprived of her liberty, living in a nursing home where she can receive routine treatment for diabetes, avoiding the risks of diabetic coma, or should she be returned home, which is her expressed wish, with the best care, support and treatment package from adult social care and from district nurses and her GP, in an effort to minimize the risk of diabetic coma? What should the decisions be? Court of Protection was required to rule on both of these cases, and you can find out by reading the case law judgments what the Court of Protection decided in each case. And then my other observation about mental capacity, which I wanted to share, and I flagged it up earlier when I used the phrase executive functioning, is not simply relying on what an individual says, but actually factoring in their behavior, what we observe them doing or not doing, particularly when there are repetitive patterns. And if you have an opportunity to talk with occupational therapists, they may well tell you that they are trained to do functional assessments. In other words, not just to rely on what an individual says, but actually to observe what an individual can or cannot do, even something as simple as making a cup of tea. And that's executive functioning, that is executive capacity. And it's illustrated in this particular slide, which has been given to me and indeed to all of us by a social worker working with people experiencing homelessness and substance misuse in Manchester. Her name is Ellie Atkins. And again, if through Google you access YouTube, you can find some videos and materials put together by Ellie Atkins. And some of those materials focus on executive functioning. And this particular slide, which Ellie developed, illustrates the importance of not simply relying on what an individual says, but looking at what an individual does or does not do. Because prolonged exposure to trauma, prolonged exposure to alcohol or other drugs can significantly impact on the frontal lobe of the brain, and that controls our executive functioning. So particularly where you have got repetitive patterns of behavior, it's important to factor in executive functioning to capacity assessments. And this particular slide gives you a case law reference, again, which you can Google, bottom right, the case of GW versus a local authority. That was an example of the Court of Protection, in fact, not simply relying on what GW said, but actually factoring into the Court of Protection's decision-making her observed behaviour. And this guidance from NICE highlights once again the importance of factoring in executive functioning. And there are other Court of Protection decisions that highlight the importance of real-world observation, and indeed safeguarding adult reviews, two of which I've mentioned today, two of which are additional, which also talk about the importance of executive functioning. So that brings me more or less to the end of my presentation. When you see the slides, you will see that there are there is some additional material about the 6 safeguarding adult principles in the care and support statutory guidance. You can see that there are a couple of summary slides about what is most likely to be effective when working with people who self-neglect. But I've more or less come to the end of my presentation. I will stop sharing my slides and invite you in the time that we have left to offer any observations that you wish to make about your own lived experience of work, or indeed about the presentation, and to ask any questions that you might have. At this point, I think Karen will stop recording the session so that we can talk quite openly if that is what you would like to do. So I will stop sharing my slides, come back into the whole room. You are welcome to turn your cameras on and to unmute yourselves if you wish to participate in a conversation for the next short period of time. Can be quite a bold step to be the first person to raise a hand, but maybe someone in the audience might have an observation to make or a question to ask and feel brave enough to go first. So thank you for listening. Hope you found it useful. Please do use the slides when Karen sends them to you. No further permission needed. Just use the slides if you find them useful. Right, I'll stop talking and I'll cope with the silence until someone raises a virtual hand. Karen, I see, has put some things in the chat, links to various things which you might find helpful. So, over to you.